Okay, we're going to be talking about the scribes and Pharisees. Kind of the first part of this lesson will focus on who they were and what they were about and why that's important. And then kind of the second part of the lesson we'll turn that around and say, okay, now how does that apply to us today? I have spent about 2 weeks trying to decide if I wanted to do this with a PowerPoint or on the board, and I finally decided we're going to do both. And maybe this is a terrible idea. I've never done both before. We'll see how it goes. Regardless, let's look first at the scribes and Pharisees and who they were. The scribes, I think we all have a vague idea kind of what they were and what they were about. Let's talk for just a minute just to kind of refresh that in our memory. The scribe, their literal job was to read and write. Remember, this is a society where lots and lots of people could not read or write. That's pretty weird to us in our society because of public education. It's rare for a person to not be able to read and write. Most of us, we probably know some people that struggle with that, but we probably don't know very many people that were never trained whatsoever. But in this society, there was a lot of people who could not read or write, especially for the 50% of the population that happened to be female. So a scribe and Pharisee, his basic job was if you had some document, you needed to understand what it meant, you went to him and he could read that to you, and he would understand the language and the legal words and all that. Or if you needed something written, you would go to him and have that done. It was almost kind of like a lawyer type service. You know, I need to do a will, so I'm going to go see the lawyer, that sort of thing. But because they were able to read and write, read from the scriptures, that took on a religious role also because they could read and tell people what the scriptures said. Then you had your Pharisees. Pharisees were a lot like the rabbis, who were the preachers or the teachers or the priests or however you want to call it, but they were kind of like the super level of that. The Pharisees had, over the years, they had taken God's Old Testament law, and let's say it was about this big, all the laws and rules and regulations in the Old Testament. They had started out teaching that, which is a good thing. But over the centuries, they started adding to it, until they had built up a huge volume of rules and regulations, most of which were never in the Bible in the first place. They had just come up with those. So then they took all those things, and the Pharisees were a little sect, a little group of people who kind of held themselves as they were the bigwigs. They were the ones, we know more about God's law than anybody else, and everybody else needs to obey whatever we tell you, and, we set the standard kind of people. And so everybody was supposed to look up to them. They were a big deal because they were the holiest people around, and that's kind of what people thought about them in that society. So when Jesus says, back in our text from Matthew 5 and verse 20, he says, "For I say to you," and remember, he's talking to just the common man, common people out here listening to him. "For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll by no means, there's no way for you to ever see the kingdom of heaven." Now, that's another one of those times when I wish I had video of this event happening, because I imagine all the people listening to him were looking at each other saying, "Did you hear what he just said? What in the world? How could we normal people be more righteous?" They're the Pharisees. These are the guys up on a pedestal as far as God's law is concerned. How on earth could we be more righteous than them? They're obviously the most righteous ones. We know they are because they keep telling us all our lives that they are. So Jesus says, no, you've got to be better than those guys are. Well, let's talk about what was wrong with those guys, those scribes and Pharisees, the so-called religious elite at that time. Jesus here is going to, not in this specific place, but in a couple of other places in Matthew and one in Luke that I'm going to use, is going to tell us what was wrong with what these scribes and Pharisees were doing and teaching. First off, from Matthew 23, the first 4 verses in Matthew 23. "Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat," meaning they're the leaders of the religion. "Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do. But do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. See, the first problem he points out here is these Pharisees, the scribes, but particularly the Pharisees, they had a big inclination to tell everybody what they're supposed to do, but they're not actually doing it themselves. They were teaching the truth, at least part of it, but they didn't very often practice what they preached. Do you remember when we were kids and sometimes your parents would tell you to do something? You'd be like, well, that's not, and they would say something like, well, do as I say, not as I do. That drove me nuts when I was a kid. That's not fair. How come you can do that, but I can't? That's not fair at all. Now, obviously, as an adult, I understand that a lot better. As an adult, I'm not going to say the kids can do everything I can do. Got a package at school the other day, pulled out my knife to cut this package open. A couple of kids went, hey, you can't have a pocket knife at school. I said, no, you can't have a pocket knife at school. I can. So yeah. The problem here is in religion, things of God, these Pharisees were holding themselves up on this high status and telling everybody else and making sure that you all see us as a high status, but they weren't actually living that way at all. They were doing these things, they were saying these things and trying to hold everybody else to a certain standard, and then thinking they could go and live however they wanted to. Next, we'll also be over in Matthew 23. In Matthew 23, verse 5 through 7, Jesus talks about that they were quite well known for doing things to be seen by other people, to kind of hold themselves up and put themselves on that pedestal. From Matthew chapter 23, it's 23 instead of 24. Matthew 23, verse 5 through 7, Jesus is talking about them. But all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad. What that is just some of the things on their garments that they wore. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. Now, we think, okay, what does that have to do with anything? Remember, these people back then were poor, hard-working people. To make the edges of your garments real broad and wide, you couldn't waste extra material like that. Oh, but if you're rich, that's one way you show off that you're rich and important. You waste that extra material, make your clothes more fancy. Keep going in verse 6. They love the best places at feasts, the best seats in the synagogues. Remember a few months ago we talked about how the tables would be arranged at these feasts. And if you were up here at the head table or close to the head table, that meant you were more fancy or more important. That's what he's talking about there. The best seats in the synagogue. Remember, the synagogue is their temple where they had religious worship, kind of sort of like our building today. I've seen some pictures of ones that have been found through archaeology, basically kind of a rectangular building. Now, for us today, it doesn't really matter where you sit. All the seats are pretty much equal. But back then, again, the more up close you are, the more important you are. And, me and you regular people, we're, kind of at the back. And the important people are up front. They love the best seats in the synagogues. They want to make sure they're up front where everybody can see them and go, oh, that's brother so-and-so. They're so holy. Verse 7, they love the greetings in the marketplaces, to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. They wanted, when they were out walking around town, for people, oh, hey, brother, how, and kind of bow down to them and put them up on that pedestal. They wanted to be seen of men. They enjoyed wearing these clothing items that made them stand out. Your common man wore just kind of that robe and tunic that we all kind of picture. But no, not the Pharisees. They got on all the fancy clothes with the highly decorated colors, all these. They wanted to stand out. They delighted in places of honor and titles of honor. I will say, you know what that kind of reminds me of? Do we have a religious group in our world today that's kind of like that? It kind of makes me think about the Catholic religion. Their priests wear a certain garment so they can make sure they stand out from everybody else. And they love to be called, oh, Father so-and-so, even though the Bible says not to do that. and, they have all these rules they follow. And then they have, the regular priest, as I understand it, kind of has that little black uniform. But now if you're a bishop or a cardinal, the cardinals, they've got a bright red uniform because they're even more important. And then you get up to the Pope and he's got that funky hat because he's even more important. It's the same exact thing. They're doing it to be seen of men, and people, oh, that's Cardinal so-and-so, and put them up on a pedestal. It's just what those people were doing then that Jesus is calling them out for. Thirdly, we see that they were known, again from Matthew 23, they were known to neglect part of God's law. Skip down to verse 23 and 24. Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done, without leaving the others undone." Let me pause right there. Again, for our society today, this is kind of hard to understand. What is he talking about? Some of those regulations that the Pharisees had added on over the years, they had gotten very, very specific about what percentage of a tithe you had to give to the temple, for even down to your little seasonings. And that's your mint, your anise, your cumin, very little minor things. How much of this you have, you need to give a certain portion of that. They had got down in these very super detailed regulations, and they made a big deal about those tiny little regulations. And from what I understand, it's mostly the ones that have to do with you give them money. And Jesus says you make all the emphasis on this, but you're not putting an emphasis on the important things, justice, mercy, and faith. Verse 24, he says, blind guides. What a great description. If we have a guide leading us someplace, wouldn't a blind guide be like the worst idea? If I'm taking a mountain trip or anything like that, I don't want my guide to be blind. That's what he calls them, blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Back then, as I understand it, of course, they didn't have ways to seal foods and drinks like we do today to preserve them. So when you were pouring a drink, it was very common to use like a cheesecloth type thing, and you would strain that through as you were pouring it to be drank, because there might be some bugs and stuff in there. And that's what Jesus is talking about. You're straining out the gnats, but you're willing to swallow a whole camel. You pay so much attention to the tiny things, and you're ignoring the giant things. And what justice, mercy, faith. They were emphasizing the lighter matters of the law. They were neglecting the weightier matters of the law. Some people have a saying, majored in the minors and minored in the majors. Kind of goes along with that. And then the last one was they were well known to be lovers of money. And we'll turn over to Luke for this one. From Luke chapter 16. Luke 16, and we're going to go to verse 13 through 15. Jesus says, "No servant can serve two masters." Pause right there before I even get a few words in. Again, to us, this doesn't have, I think, the depth that it originally did. I think of servant and masters, can't serve two masters. I think of like an employee-employer relationship. Well, hey, I've had two jobs. Lots of times I've had two jobs at a time. That's not what Jesus is talking about. Servant and masters, he's talking about a slave-master relationship. A slave is not going to be owned by more than one person. A slave answers to one person and one person only, and that is the master. A slave can't answer to two guys. He can only answer to his master. No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be loyal to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. And I try to always pause whenever I read the word mammon and remind myself. When we read the word mammon, we usually say, well, that means money. It's a little bit deeper than that. The literal translation, it's kind of awkward in English as I've read. But what it means is more, it's money and the stuff that we get because we have money. Those nicer cars, bigger houses, fancier things that we have. Mammon is money and the stuff that comes with it, okay? Jesus says here at the end of verse 13, you cannot serve God and mammon. Let me read 14 and 15. Now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, also heard these things, and they derided him. Fun thing, I learned that the word derided here in the original Hebrew or the original Greek, it means they turned up their noses at him. You know, we still have that expression, turning up your nose. That's literally what this word means. Jesus said you can't serve God and mammon, and they turned up their noses. They didn't want to hear any of that. Verse 15, and he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God. So I think we could say, you know, kind of what Jesus is saying here in shorthand. The God they were really paying attention to was mammon. It was money and the stuff that goes along with it. I've been reading for, 6 months or so. I've been reading off and on about the crucifixion of Jesus, trying to learn more about that because I want to make a lesson or a few lessons about that. And you know one thing that I'm starting to understand I didn't understand before? Power and wealth. Power and money were a really, really big part of the reason Jesus was crucified. When the Jewish leaders wanted to get rid of him, and we all know they used the Romans to do it, when those Jewish leaders wanted to get rid of him, their motivation, their bottom line reason for that, it turns out it boils down a whole lot to they were trying to hold on to their power, and there was a whole lot of money coming in because of that. You know those, when Jesus flips over the tables from the money changers, guess who gets a kickback from those money changers for years and years and years? It's the guys running this show. Those animals, the birds and everything they were selling, and Jesus said you're making the house of God into a shop. My paraphrase, obviously. Guess who they're paying up to? It's the people that run the temple. There's a whole lot of power and money going on here. Jesus here in our text from Luke chapter 16, flat out to their face, tells the Pharisees, this is what you're like. You're all about this money and power, the mammon that comes along with it. Again, I was reading about this and I started thinking about some of the things that pass for Christianity in our society today. Have you heard of the health and wealth gospel? I've read that this is the number one fastest growing segment or teaching of Christianity. It's led by men like Joel Osteen is kind of almost a household word now. He's got TV shows, radio shows, all kinds of stuff. Has a church in a football stadium. And if you go to any bookstore, you'll find a whole shelf of his books. He's a mega multimillionaire now through preaching. But the health and wealth gospel that he and others preach is basically, I read just a little bit about it, it's basically if you have enough faith, you'll have all the money you need. If you have enough faith, you'll get rid of whatever disease or health problem is beplexing you. If you don't have enough money or you don't have good enough health, it's a faith problem. And you just work on your faith and all that'll be better. And I'm sure a portion of that is sending some money to him. But that's their, it's kind of like these guys. It's all about the money, and they're using the guise of being godly in order to do it. So this is what is going on with the scribes and Pharisees that Jesus is calling out. I want to go ahead and read our text again, since I've done a whole lot of talking and been down several roads since we read this text. Let's focus back on it now. From Matthew chapter 5 down in verse 20. Jesus says, for I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter into the kingdom of heaven. What Jesus is doing here is he's saying, all right, this is what's been going for the religion of God, the worship of God. He's raising the bar. That's not good enough. If you want to be a child of God, you're going to have to do a lot better than that. Christianity in so many ways raises the bar of love and so many things. And this is one of those occasions of this. So what Jesus is saying here is, if you're going to be a follower of his, if you're going to be a Christian, If you want to have a hope of seeing heaven someday, you cannot be like this. And he's given us 4 very clear, very simple, very easy examples. You cannot be like these people if you're going to be a Christian and want to go to heaven someday. Because what it all comes down to, we're in Matthew 5. Let's just turn the page over to chapter 7, verse 21. Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but," or instead, "he who does the will of my Father in heaven." In other words, you can't just call yourself a Christian and that's going to be good enough. Now that scares me in a lot of different ways. It scares me in, I'm probably not doing enough. I'm quite sure I'm not doing enough. But it scares me even more because I'm surrounded by people. Most of the people that I know, most of the people I love, most of the people that are my friends and neighbors and loved ones have this idea that as long as I call myself a Christian, I'm basically a good person. That's all I really have to do. This world and the prince of this world has made sure that they have learned, don't worry about that old book. Don't worry about all those things God said or that Jesus said. You just be a good person and you'll go to heaven someday. Virtually everybody I know, that's their religious belief. What did Jesus say again? Matthew 7:21. "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,'" that's people calling out for him, "shall enter into the kingdom of heaven. Instead, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven." We learn, and I'm going to stay now, I'm going to go look at, we're going to switch now after learning about the scribes and Pharisees and what they were like. Now let's turn that camera around and let's look at our own lives. And we're going to go through this and we're going to think about how this applies to us. First, we see we cannot say and do not. That can't be in a Christian's life. We read there in Matthew 7, verse 21, in other places, Jesus uses the word that's been translated in English as hypocrite. Hypocrite. You know what the word hypocrite means? It's an ancient Greek word. It means a pretender. It literally means an actor in a play, but the way I like to remember it, it means somebody who's pretending. These men were pretending to be godly when they were really doing all this other stuff. Jesus is telling us, if you want to be a Christian, what was our original in Matthew 5, verse 20? If you want to see the kingdom of heaven someday, you better not be a pretender. You better not tell people you're a Christian when you're really not living that way at all. That's our first thing. We cannot do things. Matthew 6, verse 1. We cannot do, take heed that you do not, hold on, let me finish with this one first. We have to make sure that I'm not just telling people I'm a Christian. I'm not just showing up at church sometime. I'm not just making sure my parents or my family members think that I'm doing good when really I'm doing whatever I want to do the rest of the week. We can't be a pretend Christian. What was the original text in Matthew 5, verse 20? You're not going to see the kingdom of heaven. That's all there is to it. To me, that's a whole lot to think about right there. Let's move on. To be seen by men is Matthew 6, verse 1. Jesus says, "Take heed," pay attention, "that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father in heaven." We cannot do things just to be seen by men. I can't go out, I did some good deed and I'm going to tell everybody about it because I want them to think good about me. That's the wrong reason. The reason is the problem. Did you do a good deed because your reason was you wanted to tell people about it, or do you wanted people to see you doing it? Or did you do a good deed because it was the Christian thing to do? Whatever good deeds, and hopefully we have lots of good deeds in our lives, but we should be doing them because it's the right thing to do. It's the Christian thing to do. And that's the only motivation we have. We're done with that right there. Next, we see we as Christians cannot neglect pieces of God's law. Well, I've just messed my PowerPoint all up. Here we go. This is where we should be. We cannot neglect parts of God's law. If I'm going to be a Christian, I do not get to pick and choose the parts of the New Testament that I want to listen to. Now, are there some parts that maybe I agree with real easy, and maybe there's some other parts that I kind of struggle with personally? Sure, I think we all have strengths and weaknesses. You know, there's certain sins that might tempt someone really, really strongly that I just don't care about those things at all. There might be other sins that other people don't care about at all, but boy, I struggle with that one. We have to make sure that we're following all of God's law. Our New Testament commands have to be focus of our lives. Our text was from Matthew 5, verse 20. Let's read the verse right above that, verse 19. Jesus says, "Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." You cannot pick and choose the parts of God's law that you want to follow. I always think of the stories that Carl Johnson or Joe Heisel will tell about somebody that said, well, it doesn't say that in my Bible. And you go and look, and sure enough, they literally cut that part out, like with a little pair of scissors. They cut that part out of their Bible. Well, it doesn't say that in my Bible. Okay, if you can explain to me how you're going to defend that in front of God on Judgment Day, I'm here to listen to that explanation, because I just don't see how that's going to work. We cannot neglect any of the parts of the New Testament. We have to follow all of them. And lastly, we cannot be lovers of money and the stuff that all comes with it. We all know, I think, that in our society, this is probably one that a lot of us struggle with. I have read that if you own a car, you are in the top 25% of the wealth of this world. That kind of worries me a little bit. Because whenever in the Bible I read things like you can't be lovers of money or the rich or things like that, I always think about, the rich. We all know who the rich are, right? That's all those multimillionaires and the billionaires, the oligarchy. We all know, that's those mega rich celebrities, those ball players that are making $300 million. That's the rich, right? Well, in my view, that's the rich. But I started thinking, what is God's view about that? If God can see the whole planet at once, and if the statistic that I read is correct, that said if you own a vehicle, you're in the top 25% wealth in the world, doesn't that make us the rich people? Me and you? We might not consider ourselves rich at all because of the wealth of our society. But if on planet Earth we're the richest people, all of a sudden I'm thinking we need to pay a whole lot more attention to those verses about money and mammon and the rich. Because it turns out that's not talking about those people. That's talking about me. That's talking about us. And that might be something we need to get real serious about. From Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, Jesus says, "No one can serve two masters, for either he'll hate the one and love the other, or he'll be loyal to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." One of them is going to be more important to you. And we need to make sure which one it is. And that's a personal thing that every single one of us has to think about in our own heart and our own mind. These things should serve as a warning to any of us who are Christians. If these things are in my life, I have got to get this fixed. When Jesus specifically called out or pointed out these items and said, those Pharisees are wrong and you have to have greater righteousness than that, that means I better make sure that these things are not in my life. We have to make sure that we combine our faith, looking at that number 1 there, we have to combine our profession of faith with the deeds that go along with it. Of course, I'm turning over to James, as soon as I can find James. From James chapter 2, we all know that famous passage. Why am I struggling here? We all know that famous passage. James says, show me your faith and I'll show you my deeds, because you can't have faith without deeds. Where I'm really wanting to go to is 1 John, because there's a couple of passages here. From 1 John 2, verse 4, 5, and 6. He who says, I know him, and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, truly the love of God is perfected in him. By this we know that we are in him. He who says he abides in him ought himself also to have walked just as he walked. I can't say and do not. I've got to do as Jesus did and want to be that way. The very next chapter, 1 John 3, down in verse 18. My little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. If I'm a Christian, I can't be doing things just to be seen of people, trying to look like I'm doing a good job and think I'm going to fool people. Mark chapter 4. Down in verse 22, Jesus said, for there is nothing hidden which will not be revealed, nor has anything been kept secret, but should come to light. We have to make sure that we are trying our best to do all the parts of God's law, everything that Jesus commanded. We all know the end of Matthew chapter 20, the passage we usually call the Great Commission. From Matthew 28, rather, down in verse 20, he said, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the world. We can also read from 2 John. There's a really nice little verse. 2 John in verse 9. 2 John, verse 9. Whosoever transgresses and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine of Christ has both the Father and the Son. And we have to make sure that we work to keep ourselves as far as we can from materialism, money, and all the stuff that gets to go with it. A couple of famous passages I want to point out. First from 1 Timothy, the end of 1 Timothy down in chapter 6. 1 Timothy 6, verse 9 and 10, Paul writes, but those who desire to be rich, and again, I'm going to pause and think, we're not talking about those mega billionaires, we're talking about us. Those who desire to be rich fall into temptations and a snare. What's a snare? It's a trap. Paul is telling us there is a trap Satan has laid out for you. Avoid it. Don't fall into this trap. I'm telling you about it so you can stay away from it. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. I always think about that line, pierce themselves through with many sorrows, anytime I read this. You know what I've decided as an adult? This world has a lot of sorrows in it. There's enough sorrows to go around. We got sickness, we have tragedies, horrible things in our lives. There is enough sorrows. We don't need to make more. Paul says when you fall into this greediness, you pierce yourself through. The word picture there is you've got a sword or a spear or whatever. You're piercing yourself through with many sorrows. Why would we do that to ourselves? Think about your life. Has there not been enough tragedy? Has there not been enough pain? that we pierce ourselves through, and it's all about mammon, the money and the stuff that goes along with it. And yet I still want that bigger lawnmower because it's got 6 inches more. It's a 52 instead of a 46. I really want that bigger lawnmower. I've got a house with extra bedrooms, but I wish I had a bigger one. I've got 2 very good running vehicles, but I still want a newer one. I haven't been fishing in years, but boy, how I want a bass boat. This is what we're like as humans. If we're going to be a Christian leading a Christian life, we've got to fight against these things. Doesn't mean you can't have nice stuff. It means you better make sure that nice stuff is not what's running your life. One last passage on this from 1 John chapter 2. 1 John 2, verse 15, 16, and 17. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world is passing away, and the lust of it. But he who does the will of God abides forever. What Jesus has taught us here in this passage from Matthew 5, verse 20, is that God wanted his children in what was still Old Testament times, what he wanted from them back then was a simple compliance with his laws. Just do these things, check off this list, and everything's going to be fine. But what God is calling us to now as Christians is a higher level of that. A higher level of the righteousness is what we've talked about. You know how it's easier for me to remember in my mind? Obedience and love. God's calling us to a higher level of obedience and a higher level of love. Our righteousness has to be what was on the slide that I just got rid of. Our righteousness has to be God-centered, not self-centered. Our righteousness has to be based on doing things God's way, not our way. We can't be just following a checklist. We have to actually be living this way because it's what's in our heart. And it's based on what God does in us, not what we do ourselves. Our Christianity has to be real. We can't be a pretender. We can't think, I'll just act like I'm doing what God wants me to do, and that's going to be good enough. Jesus told us right there, it's not going to be good enough. This morning, the lesson is yours, and I hope it gives you some things to think on. It gives you, it certainly has given me a lot to think about.